My name is Pip Spizzi, and I'm the principal investigator for the Alaska EPSCoR program, which is the established program to stimulate competitive research. This is a really exciting program because we get to work with dozens of researchers across the state of Alaska, really addressing the challenges that are important in Alaska.
The goal of the Coastal Margins part of the Fire and Ice project is to understand how changes in freshwater are affecting downstream ecosystems. We're studying areas that are undergoing rapid change. There's changes in precipitation, there's glaciers that are melting in these systems that we're looking at, and all of that freshwater is moving downstream into the marine environment and affecting habitats and species there.
Alaska, where we're at right now, is a place that's experiencing relatively profound climate change, and part of that climate change is impacts to how water moves, how water is moving throughout Earth's systems.
This is a really big project and a really large-scale project. I think the uniqueness of it is that it's being done in different watersheds. We're doing sites in two different areas in the Gulf of Alaska because we want to see how general the trends that we're seeing are. If we were just to do one area like Ketchimek Bay, then we could only speak to Ketchimek Bay. But what we want to see is if trends are similar no matter where you are in the Gulf.
So we have 5 sites here in Ketchimek Bay. They span along from Jackaloff all the way up to Gruing, and they follow along the sort of glacial gradient that we see.
In this direction is the Gruing Glacier. So we are in one of the end member watersheds. This is the most glaciated end member of our system in Ketchimek Bay. There's about 60% glacial coverage here.
So we're looking at different amounts of glaciation across watersheds in the same area to see how these glaciers are responding to climate change, and then in turn, how does that impact the amount of water going into streams and then ultimately coming out into Ketchimek Bay.
We're really interested in how freshwater coming off the coastal temperate rainforest impacts nearshore ecosystems. That freshwater is highly impacted by how much glacier coverage is in various watersheds, both glacial coverage and forest and wetland coverage.
We expect to see differences in the habitats. So glacial rivers are bringing really fine sediment down into the estuary, into the nearshore, and that affects the types of species that like to live there.
And then also geochemically, when we're putting fresh water out into the bay, it impacts the ability of the bay to cycle carbon. So it changes how sensitive the bay is to acidity. That's a big part of the shifts in climate, and shifts in atmospheric carbon are impacting the ability of oceans and bays to absorb carbon, and that's impacted by freshwater glaciers coming out into the bay.
So today we're collecting water samples from a variety of rivers along the Juneau Road system. All of these drain into Lynn Canal, and what we're really interested in is understanding the flux of materials. So that would be nutrients and sediment and fresh water that's coming from these watersheds into the marine ecosystems in Lynn Canal.
So we work with hydrologists to study the watershed and riverine characteristics, and then we study the biological systems downstream. So that means studying the intertidal and subtidal benthic ecosystems, surveying communities, as well as we do fish seining to study the local fish assemblages, and we do offshore plankton tows to look at the plankton in the water.
We have a lot of different sampling happening, and some of it involves fishing for science. So we have a crew that goes out and sets a beach seine, and we capture whatever fish are there in the estuary, and we measure and count all of them. And that gives us a sense of the diversity of those fish communities. And then we have another team that goes out and looks at the rocky communities. So what types of algae and invertebrates are living in the rocks that are close to these river deltas? And again, how does their diversity and their numbers change across that gradient? And then we're measuring different characteristics of the habitat, especially things like water temperature and salinity, turbidity, dissolved oxygen, all of the things that affect what organisms can live in these environments.
Mostly a lot of staghorn sculpin and a handful of starry flounder, and then we get a handful of other things like juvenile salmonids. We got a juvenile coho today and a juvenile chinook. And then some stickleback and rock soles. We get a handful of different kinds of flatfish, and that's most of it. These tend to be not very diverse estuaries. There's a ton of stuff in them, but it's usually the same handful of species, especially the staghorn sculpin and the starry flounder.
systems that are glaciated now may not be in 50 to 100 years from now. And so how will the chemistry of those streams change, and how will the food webs of those streams support change as well? And those food webs, of course, support commercial, recreational, and subsistence fisheries that are important to the state of Alaska.
There's a lot of stakeholders and a lot of end users to this information, but one of the goals is that it might be able to help guide the people who are doing commercial fishing, subsistence fishing, who rely on Kachemak Bay for those resources.
Especially in places that have boreal forests along the circumpolar north, but also in terms of how people are adapting to changing environments in general. The information that we're learning here can help other communities across the world prepare for some of these changes.